In this Tarkir Dragonstorm limited set review, I will be evaluating every common and uncommon in the format to help you prepare for your limited events. I will be using the following card evaluation grade scale. First up are the best cards. These are cards you actively want to play and should prioritize. Next are the solid cards. These are cards you will mostly play if you are in those colors. Next are filler cards, which are cards you will sometimes play. Sometimes they only fit into one or two strategies, and so you won't always need them in your deck, and other times they're just a little bit weaker. Those are the three main categories, but there are also build-around cards, which are cards that need certain conditions to be useful. They can vary in power level, but they need a little bit of extra work in deck building. And then there are bad cards, which are not that frequent these days, but these are cards that you should avoid if possible. This is the general way I advise building a sealed pool with these grading scales in mind, just sorting by color and by the power level grades to help you determine which colors have your highest quantity of cards in each category. So if you're sorting by cards, don't worry about these individual cards for now. I will be getting to them, don't worry. But if you sort your pool like this, then you'll be able to see, oh, I have a lot of great cards in these colors, and so I should be trying to play those colors. The color combos that are supported in this set, just for some context when I'm evaluating the cards, for those ones that fit into specific strategies particularly well, there is Abzan Counters, which is white, black, green. There is Jeskai Multi-Spell, which is a deck that cares about casting multiple spells. Blue, red, and white is those colors. There is Sultai Graveyard Value, so black, green, and blue for those. And then Mardu Token Aggro, which is red, white, and black, so that cares about going wide and using those tokens. And then Teamer Stompy, which cares about playing big creatures in green, blue, and red. Now, there are some mechanics in this format. I will be covering some cards just to explain their mechanics, and then I'll cover those cards more specifically in their own sections. But first up, we have Kintree Nurturer for the Endure mechanic. Endure is followed by a number, and that number means that you can either put that many counters on a creature or create a spirit creature token that is that size. So in the case of Endure 1, you can either put a +1/+1 counter or create a 1/1 spirit. The next mechanic is Renew. So that is an ability that is in the graveyard. You can pay the renew cost, exile the card from your graveyard to get the effect. So in the case of Agent of Codis, you exile it from your graveyard and pay 4 mana to put 2 +1/+1 counters on a target creature, activate as a sorcery. You can then have the Mobilize mechanic, which is whenever this creature attacks, create a tapped and attacking 1/1 red warrior creature token, which is equal to the number of Mobilize counters. So not Mobilize on the card. So Mobilize 1, you'll create 1 token. If the Mobilize number is something like 3, you'll create 3 tokens, and then they get sacrificed at the beginning of the next end step. There is also the Flurry mechanic, which is when you cast your second spell each turn, this creature has its Flurry ability trigger. So in the case of Devoted Duelist, it will deal 1 damage to each opponent. It's also worth noting that this can trigger on your turn and your opponent's turn, because it just is whenever you cast your second spell each turn instead of something like your turn. Then there is the Harmonize mechanic, which is you can cast it from your graveyard for its Harmonize cost, and you may tap a creature you control to reduce that cost by X, where X is its power, then exile the spell. So a way to get extra value from spells that go to your graveyard. There is also the Behold mechanic. So if you have a dragon creature type in play or have one in your hand, when you cast a spell, you can reveal the dragon from your hand or just control one and then get the Behold benefit. So in that case, Caustic Exhale will cost less mana if you have a dragon or have one in your hand. And then finally, there is the Omen mechanic, which is an alternate way to cast your cards. So if you choose to cast your Durgar Island Dragon normally, you can get a 6 mana 4/4 flying ward 2, but you could also play the Omen ability to tap up to 1 target creature, draw a card, and then you, after the resolution, you shuffle the Durgar Island Dragon back into your deck. So that is the Omen mechanic. Okie doke. There is also a hybrid mana system with some of the cards in the set where you can pay 2 or that color. So in the case of Reigning Victor, you can either play it for 3 mana if you have red, white, and black. But if you don't have one of those colors, you can also just pay 2 mana instead of any of those individual colors. So you could just pay 6 colorless mana for this card or any combination thereof. Okie doke. Now that we've gotten through all the mechanics and some general sense of the grading scale, let's get to it. First up is Descendant of Storms. This is going to be in the best category because a 1 mana 2/1 hits really hard, and because of its ability to pay 2 mana to endure 1 when it attacks, you're going to be able to potentially get a bunch of tokens with this in the early game before your opponent has good blocks. Next is Salt Road Pack Beast. Because of the ability to make a lot of tokens in the Mardu decks, where you are going to be having that Mobilize mechanic, you are going to be able to get a lot of creatures into play before your end step, and so casting Salt Road Pack Beast early in the game is going to be quite feasible, and a 4/3 that draws you a card is great. Next is Static Snare. Similarly, you're going to be able to have a lot of attackers, especially in your Mardu decks, so you're going to be able to cast this removal spell for very cheap to exile artifacts or creatures an opponent controls. This also does trigger if your opponent is attacking you with a lot of creatures, so it kind of plays both sides of the ball great in that way. Next is Sun Pearl Kirin, another card in this tier. It's a 2-mana 2/1 flash flyer, so you can protect your key threats if your opponent tries to kill them, but generally you can also just use this to attack with your creatures, get those mobilized tokens, and then bounce one of them back to your hand to draw a card, which is really nice because a 2-mana 2/1 flash flyer that draws a card is excellent. Next is Furious Forebear. This card is excellent as well in those mobilized decks because whenever a creature you control dies, if this is in your graveyard, you can pay 2 to return it from your graveyard to your hand. And so those tokens are going to be dying all of the time. So this is going to be very easy to return back to your hand and then play again and have it die and then play it again. And it's just great. Next is Tarkir Dragonstorm. 4 mana, make a couple of 2/2 creatures. And then if you play a dragon, you can get this back. So even without getting it back, it's just a really rock solid card. But if you ever get it back a single time, this card just absolutely decimates your opponent and just makes a huge army with just one card. So this card is really strong as well. Next is Loxodon Battle Priest, a card that demands an answer because it's just going to start growing your creatures and triggering your +1/+1 synergies and all sorts of things like that. So as a 5-mana 3/5 that immediately can put counters around on your other creatures, it's a really nice threat. There's also Rally the Monastery, which is a card that you're hopefully going to be casting for 2 mana in a lot of cases. Making a couple monks with prowess is really good because 1/1s with prowess tend to be pretty good because whenever you cast spells, they grow. Also, buffing up your creatures as an option is really strong because that can potentially win 2 combats, and then destroying creatures that are big is also useful just to have as an option. There is Stormplane Detainment, 3 mana exile enchantment-based removal for white, just a rock-solid card that you're going to be happy to play. Moving on to some of the solid cards, Starry-Eyed Skyrider is going to be really good in your Mardu decks because it gives your tokens that are attacking flying and also just really helps enable your attacks in general. Maybe not as good in some of your other decks, but a really strong card in those aggressive Mardu decks. Next is Fortress Kinguard, a card that you're just going to be happy playing in any deck. You're generally going to want to make a 2-mana 1/1+1/2, but you can also have the option to put a counter on it if you have cards that care about having other creatures with counters on it. So it really just fits into every strategy great. Next is Poised Practitioner. This card is going to be really at home in the Jeskai decks that care about casting multiple spells because it's a growing threat that gives you a little bit of card selection with the scrying. But a 3-mana 2/3 that has the ability to become a 3/4 and get you that scry is just going to be a generally solid card. Next is Storm Beacon Blade. This card really fits well into the Mardu decks that are trying to attack with a bunch of creatures at once, and this just fuels you by giving you extra stats, but also the ability to draw cards and make those keep the cards flowing so you can continue your aggression. Next is Coordinated Maneuver. This card's really nice because you can attack, get all those mobilized tokens, and then you can use this before your opponent has the chance to block and just kill their bigger creatures. And then also being able to kill enchantments is a nice option to have. Next is Rebellious Strike. This card plays really well because when you attack your opponent and try to use those mobilized tokens, your opponent's going to often try to block them with their 2/2s and stuff like that. And this ability to just make one of your 1/1s into a 4/1 temporarily, draw a card, make a nice trade in combat with a creature that was going to die anyway is great. It also plays well with Prowess because you get to play a non-creature spell and then also just draw more cards to find more non-creature spells. So a nice little solid combat trick there. Then there is Wayspeaker Bodyguard, another way to get some extra value on your card by returning your small non-land permanents from your graveyard to your hand, and then also being able to tap things is really nice upside to have, especially if you're casting a bunch of spells to try and really stop, either slow down your opponent if you cast 2 spells on their turn, but primarily aggressively to tap down their blockers. Next is Erishin Sunshield. This card can really mess with graveyards, and there are quite a few good graveyard strategies. So attached to a 4-mana 3/4 that has some nice pseudo removal built in is just nice to have. And then there is Riling Dawnbreaker, which is either a 2-mana 2/2, which is reasonable, or a 5-mana 3/4 Flying Vigilance that can buff your other creatures, which is a really nice top-end card to have. So the optionality there makes this a really nice card to have access to. Then there is Bearer of Glory, which is a nice little 2/1 that has the ability in the late game to start pumping up your other creatures, or all of your creatures, including itself. And it also has First Strike as an attacker. So in the early turns, it's pretty hard to block. And then in the late game, it's actually a card that kind of has to be answered. So a nice solid 2-drop as well. Next is Mardu Devotee. So if you are in a Mardu deck, then this card moves from filler to solid. But if you're not in that deck, then you're generally not going to be prioritizing this card. But a 1/2 that fixes your mana and scries 2 is going to be an okay card in is going to be a solid card in your Mardu decks and okay elsewhere in occasional spots. There's also Duty Beyond Death, which plays well if you have that token strategy going where you can buff up all of your creatures at once. You can sacrifice a creature maybe that was from a mobilized token that was going to die anyway, and the creatures you control get +1/+1 counters on them is also really valuable for decks that care about those synergies as well. But it's a little bit more niche because you need to make sure you have those cards to sacrifice to make this useful. Next is Dragonback Lancer. We already discussed this. It is a little bit expensive as a 4-drop, where you oftentimes don't have as much room for 4-drops in your aggressive decks, but it totally plays out very solidly with its stats and aggression in pretty much any deck. It's just a little bit expensive. Next is Lightfoot Technique, a really reasonable combat trick. You just don't have room for all that many combat tricks in your decks, and so Lightfoot Technique is not a card that you really have to care about that much. Next is Osseous Exhale. This is just a removal spell that's just going to get the job done sometimes. It's not going to be anything crazy, so it falls into this filler category, but not a card you should be ashamed to put into your deck. It's just, in an aggressive deck, you want to be able to kill blockers before attacking, and so that's just why this card gets a little bit of a bump down. Next is Tempest Hawk, just a card that you don't really need to prioritize. If you end up with a couple of them, you can put them in your deck. They're going to do things, but generally a 3-mana 2/2 that can find another 3-mana 2/2 is just not the greatest card. Then there is Build Around as Dalkovin Pack Beasts. This card is a 3-mana 0/4, needs a little bit of help to be good, because if you're just sending it into combat, your opponent's just going to be able to like double block it, and then you just lose your Pack Beasts for free because it has 0 power. But if you have a way to buff its power, or give it some sort of extra stats, or just like give it evasion, or if you have a really good use for those tokens where you can like make great advantage of the mobilize 3, because that is a lot of tokens to make, then Dalkovin Pack Beasts can definitely make the cut. Moving on to blue. First up, we're talking about the best cards again. We've got Kishla Trawlers. So it's a 3-mana 3/2. If you have a well-stocked graveyard, you can exile a creature card and return an instant or sorcery from your graveyard to your hand, so you can get back a removal spell or something like that. Really nice card for 3 mana. Next is Wingblade Disciple. So if you're casting a lot of spells, you're going to be making lots of bird tokens, and that's really, really valuable. Just making an army, this card really has to be dealt with. And then there is Sibsig Appraiser. So it's a 3-mana 2/1, so not great stats, but you look at the top 2 cards of your library, put one into your hand, one into your graveyard, getting some nice value while also stocking your graveyard with potential cards that care about being in the graveyard is just an excellent card for 3 mana. Next is Veteran Ice Climber. So it's a 2-mana 1/3 that can't be blocked, and when it attacks, you can mill cards equal to its power. So you can technically mill your opponent. So if they've been doing a lot of self-mill, you can maybe mill them out, but generally you're going to want to mill yourself to get your cards that have the renew abilities or the harmony abilities into your graveyard. So that's a really nice synergy piece. Speaking of cards that you might want to care about having a full graveyard, Aegis Sculptor, it's a 4-mana 2/3, but as you get to your upkeep, you can exile 2 cards from your graveyard to put a counter onto it. So if you have cards that don't particularly care about being in the graveyard, but you're filling your graveyard, Sculptor is a nice little payoff as a growing threat. There is Dispelling Exhale, so a 2-mana counter spell, and if you have a dragon, it's really much harder to pay the 4 mana than it is to pay the 2, but often in the early turns, making them pay 2 is all you will need, so even without dragons can be a totally solid card to include, especially because in the late game, if you have a dragon in play, then it's when it really powers itself up. Next is Roiling Dragonstorm, so a nice little bit of card selection, so draw 2, discard 1, and then when you play a dragon, you get to play the Roiling Dragonstorm again, so just a nice way to just get a little bit of card advantage into your dragon deck by just being able to get rid of extra lands in the late game and just being able to find what you need in the early turns. Next is Bewildering Blizzard. So 6 mana, draw 3 at instant speed is expensive, but shrinking all of your opponent's creatures can potentially really just blow them out and win you the game. So high upside, but really expensive. And so that's why it comes in at solid. There is Durgur Island Dragon, which we already talked about. Just comes in really solid card because the 2-mana mode isn't the craziest, but it can trigger prowess, it can be used for double spelling, and also the fact that you can just play a dragon sometimes in the late game when you need that, or have it for behold abilities, is just nice to have. Next is Constrictor Sage, so 5 mana 4/4, reasonable stats, tapping a creature and putting a stun counter on it's also pretty nice. And then the renew ability is good to have access to because that's almost like half of a spell is exiling it from a graveyard to tap a creature and put a stun counter on it. So if this dies or you mill it or something like that, it's a pretty nice card to have in your graveyard. Next is Ice Rage Serpent, so nice little 5 mana 3/3, return a creature an opponent controls to its owner's hand. There are some tokens in this set, so you'll be able to bounce tokens with this some percentage of the time, and there's also creatures that are going to have some +1/+1 counters on them, so if you bounce them, they'll come back in, presumably without those +1/+1 counters in a lot of cases, so nice little tempo play, though 5 mana 3/3, a little bit small. Next is Focus the Mind. So 5 mana, draw 3, discard a card at instant speed isn't the greatest, but if you've cast another spell, you get a discount. So if you play this alongside a 2-drop, then your Focus the Mind is all of a sudden going to be a pretty reasonable way to get some card advantage, get rid of extra lands you don't need, and all just fuel your prowess cards, things like that. Next is Riverwalk Technique. So the option of being a little bit of a removal spell or a little bit of a counter spell is really nice optionality to have on this instant. And so even though 4 mana is a bit expensive, this card's going to get the job done for you a lot of the time. Next is Humbling Elder, a little bit of a combat trick built into this Flash Human Monk. That's a 1/2. This effect just plays out well. It's historically played out well, and a 1/2 can definitely interact in combat, especially when it's shrinking your opponent's creatures and potentially triggering double spells thanks to the Flash, maybe when your opponent doesn't expect it. Next is Filler. We're moving on to Teamer Devotee. It's a 2 mana 3/3 defender, and if you're a Teamer deck, this card's going to move up a little bit in value because you want to be able to cast your spells. But if you're not playing a Teamer deck, you don't generally care as much about a 2 mana 3/3 unless you're unless you're building like a super defensive deck. Next is Fresh Start. Again, if you're a defensive deck, giving something -5/-0 and making it lose its abilities is going to buy you a lot of time. But if you're an aggressive deck, shrinking their creature's power doesn't stop its toughness. So it's still going to be able to be a formidable blocker if it was a bigger creature. So if you shrink their 4/4 creature into a 0/4, it's still going to block your creatures. And if they do put enough +1/+1 counters on a creature, it might just be able to become a relevant card again. So Fresh Start, not always the best, but can be useful in defensive decks. Next is Agent of Codis. We already talked about this. This is just going to be filler because a 2 mana 2/1 and then an expensive activated ability from the graveyard is just a little bit weaker. Next is High Spire Bellringer, a 3 mana 1/4 flyer, even though it has some extra upside, is just a pretty poor stat line, and so this card is not going to be one you prioritize. There is Ringing Strike Mastery. So this is a cheap interactive spell that will then lose its value in the late game. And so if you're trying to be an aggressive strategy, this card does get a little bit better, but in a lot of strategies, you're not going to prioritize it. And it's oftentimes going to be a little bit of a liability in the late game. Then there's Snowmelt Stag, just not the greatest stat line, but it can definitely win you the game at the end because with a Vigilance creature that can be a 2/5 blocker and a 5/2 attacker with potentially unblockable, it can be pretty scary. It's just a 5/2 doesn't attack particularly well because it trades with 2-drops, so until you're giving it unblockable, it's not really that good of an attacker. Next is Spectral Denial. This card is just a little bit clunky as a counterspell, a little bit hard to use. In the late game, sure, you can counter something, but you have to hold up a lot of mana to do that because your opponent's going to have a lot of extra mana, and overall, not a card to prioritize. Next is Unending Whisper. So this is a draw card effect, so it can get you a little bit of card advantage in the late game with those Harmonize abilities, but it's generally going to be a lot of mana to get a little bit of card advantage, so not a huge priority. And then Ureni's Rebuff is a lot of mana to get a couple of bounces, which is actually not even card advantage, it's card disadvantage. It's tempo advantage, but generally you're just not going to have to prioritize this card too highly because bouncing a couple creatures, your opponent can just replay them if you're spending a lot of mana or tapping your big creatures to harmonize this out. And so generally you're going to hopefully like self-mill this and get some value from it being in your graveyard. Next is Wingspan Stride. This card is neat if you're trying to trigger double spells consistently in the late game with Flurry, so you can like bounce this to your hand, play it again, bounce this to your hand, play it again, but generally just a little bit of a weak effect on the card in general. Then some build around cards, Essence Anchor, so you surveil, so you get some card advantage, and then when you have a card leave your graveyard, you can make a 2/2. So this is actually really good build around if you have plenty of Renew cards, plenty of Harmony cards, and things like that. And Essence Anchor can be really good in those decks, but you do want to make sure you have the ability to make zombies with it. You wouldn't just play it for the surveil mode. Next is Dragonstorm Forecaster. So this card fetches up artifacts that we'll cover later. Both of those artifacts that it fetches up are filler cards. So this card's generally going to be not a huge priority because you don't really want to play a card that just only gets mediocre cards. But if you have this and you get one of each of the other cards, then it can be certainly a useful thing to potentially play if you don't have better options. Next is moving on to black. We're back into the best cards. Krumar Initiate's really great. It's a 2 mana 2/2, and then you can pay life and then a little bit of mana and whatever mana you have available to endure X. So generally, you're going to want to use this to make big tokens. So if you have 4 mana, you can pay 3 life and 4 mana to tap it and make a 3/3 token, which is pretty cool to be able to do with your Krumar Initiate. Just a card that's going to have to be answered, especially if you have some life gain in your deck to make sure that you don't run out of life to fuel it. It's going to be a really nice card to have access to and a really must-answer threat. Next is Gurmag Rakshasa. 6 mana is expensive, but it's a big menace creature. Enables an attack with the +2/+2 mode and can kill something your opponent has with the -2/-2 mode. So just a big swing when it comes into play, which is what you want for 6 mana. Next is 100 Battle Veteran. A 4 mana 4/2 that you can cast from your graveyard is just really nice. So 4 mana 4/2, and it comes back as a 4 mana 4/2. The ability to get 3 different kinds of counters isn't going to come up all that much. There's going to be +1/+1 counters, which you almost get for free, and then the finality counter, which this has. So if you can get a lifelink counter or a trample counter, those are certainly floating about, especially for certain strategies, but you don't even need to have that happen for this card to be great, and so just keep that in mind. Next is Kin Tree Nurturer. We already discussed this card a little bit. A 2/1 plus a 1/1 is just a pretty good deal for 3 mana, especially because the 2/1 has lifelink. You can even have the option of making a 3/2 lifelink, which can be relevant, especially because sometimes having a +1/+1 counter on this card is good. And generally just 3 mana 2/2 plus 1/1 has been a good card historically, and a 3 mana 2/1 lifelink plus 1/1 is also going to be good as a result. Next is Sand Skitter Outrider, another case of a card that's going to overperform what you'd expect, because a 4 mana 2/1 menace plus a 2/2 is just going to be a nice little card. Historically, again, 4 mana for 2 2/2s has been a good card, and so this card's also going to perform well, and also fueling your potential synergies with +1/+1 counters if you need those, or just making go wide strategies better for Mardu is going to be a nice ability to have. Maybe this card's a little bit high rated, but generally these sorts of cards have performed as some of the best commons in their colors. Next is Yathen Tomb Guard. This card can really just take over the game. It's got Menace. If you put a counter on itself, it will trigger its ability. So whenever a creature with a counter deals combat damage to a player, you draw a card and lose a life. So you can even sometimes play a 2-drop that puts a counter on itself. Then on turn 3, play the Yathen, immediately hit your opponent, draw a card in those cases. And even just drawing cards later in the game is still nice. Yathen Tomb Guard is excellent as a result, just because counters are pretty frequent in this format. Next is Desperate Measures. This card's going to be really nice. You can kill your opponent's creatures sometimes if they're small, so with the +1/-1. A lot of the time, though, you're going to be using it to attack with your mobilized creatures. Your opponent blocks one of the mobilized tokens. You kill your own mobilized token, draw 2 cards. So for 1 mana, drawing 2 cards is great. And then sometimes if your opponent targets your creature with a removal spell, you can also just use Desperate Measures then. Target your creature. When it dies under your control, you're going to draw those 2 cards. So 1 mana to draw 2 cards is really good, and occasionally killing your opponent's creatures also good. Next is Caustic Exhale, just a really nice efficient removal spell, especially if you have a dragon. There's also Dragon's Prey, which is another really efficient removal spell that's pretty easy to cast. And by the time your opponent's playing big dragons, you'll often be able to pay that 2 extra mana if you need to. There's also Salt Road Skirmish, so it's 4 mana, so it's a little bit worse than those other options because it's 4 mana sorcery speed, but there is going to be some benefit to making those 2 extra 1/1s. You can either deal some damage to your opponent, or you can use them for synergy with sacrifice effects or some of the other cards we've already covered. There's, moving on to the solid cards, Venerated Stormsinger in those decks that make a lot of those 1/1 mobilized tokens is going to be much better than solid. It's going to definitely move into that best category because Venerated Stormsinger says whenever it or another creature you control dies, each opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. So if you're making a bunch of mobilized tokens that are just coming into play and then dying every turn, you're going to be really draining your opponent quickly with this card, so keep an eye out for it. Next is Alchemist's Assistant. This is a great source of life gain in these slower decks. So a 2 mana 2/1 lifelink that can then renew to put a lifelink counter onto your bigger creature in the late game is really, really nice. Next is Unrooted Ancestor. So 3 mana 3/2 flash can sometimes ambush a 1/1 creature, but generally what you're going to want to be able to do is sacrifice a creature to give it indestructible. So if you're blocking with it, it's really hard to deal with because you can sacrifice a creature, though you are down a creature in that exchange. But a lot of the time, if you're attacking, the creature's already tapped, so the tap doesn't matter as much. So you can attack with this and then just sacrifice a mobilized token or something like that. So a solid card as well here. There is Abzan Devotee, so this is the best of the Devotee cycle because a 2 mana 2/1 that you can pay 3 to return from your graveyard to your hand is just a really solid card in general. And so even though it doesn't block mobilized tokens that well, it's just going to be a pretty useful card to have access to, and especially good in your Abzan decks. Next is Nightblade Brigade, so a 3 mana 1/3 Death Touch, just reasonable stats. Mobilize 1, so it's going to be able to attack constantly because of Death Touch and the Mobilize. And then when it enters, you Surveil 1, so a little bit of card selection, just a rock solid card. Next is Worthy Cost, just an effect we've seen a lot of times. There's going to be extra creatures running around, especially in Mardu, and just being able to exile things efficiently is quite good. Next is Unburied Earthcarver, so you can sacrifice creatures that were going to die anyway. You can sacrifice creatures targeted by removal, and just having this on a 2-drop is really solid. Next is Whale of War, so you can shrink all of your opponent's creatures at instant speed. That can be really formidable, especially if they're trying to enable a big attack, or you can return 2 creatures from your graveyard to your hand. Both effects are solid. They're used in very different scenarios, and that's going to be a nice flexible uncommon. Next is Feral Deathgorger. A lot of the time, putting a counter on a creature and drawing a card is reasonable, especially if you have synergies with that counter. And then in the late game, you can play a nice 3/5 Death Touch flyer that messes with your opponent's graveyard, which is nice as well. Moving on to some filler cards, we're starting with the Adorned Crocodile. A 5 mana 5/3 is just reasonable stats, and then it dies into a 2/2, also reasonable, and then the renewability is also reasonable. So just a reasonable card all around. Being 5 mana is the only reason it doesn't get ranked a little bit higher, because you don't have that much room for expensive cards like that, and this card's nothing special. It's just pretty solid all around. Next is Alicia's Legacy, so just reasonable combat trick, but you just don't have all that much room for combat tricks, but Death Touch and Indestructible, totally solid. Cruel Truths, nice little bit of card selection, card advantage, and you lose a bit of life, but it's reasonable, but 4 mana is a bit expensive for this sort of card advantage. Delta Bloodflies, 2 mana 1/2, even though it's got flying, isn't the greatest. If you do have a creature with a counter, it kind of attacks as a 2/2, so in those decks, you can bump it up a little bit more. Some decks won't have as many counters, and so just keep in mind how many +1/+1 counters you do have, and also the fact that sometimes you'll have to hold this back on defense, and a 1/2 is not a great blocker. Next is Strategic Betrayal. This card is just kind of bad. Letting your opponent exile a creature that they control means that they're just going to be able to choose their worst creature. There are a lot of tokens in this set and 1/1s and things like that. And so Strategic Betrayal is just going to be really bad in some cases. And so it's really not worth the downside or even the upside of them being able to exile their graveyard. Though if they're particularly graveyard centric, you can definitely sideboard this card in. There's also Aggressive Negotiations. Again, not a card that's just good on rate. 3 mana to make them discard a card isn't great, especially if you get into a top deck war where they have no cards in hand, and the counter does not redeem it. Though, if they have a bomb rare and you need to sideboard this card in, definitely feel free to do so. And then there's also Corroding Dragonstorm, which the dragons are pretty expensive, and you're not going to have room for all that many in your deck, so you're not going to be able to bounce these cards over and over and over as it would be if you were like doing something warrior or human or things like that. And so draining your opponent for 2 life and surveilling 2 isn't really worth a card. And so it's kind of worth like maybe 3/4 of a card or something like that. And so the fact that you're not going to be able to use this consistently unless you have a bunch of dragons, and that's just going to be hard to do. Generally, I'd avoid this card. Though if you do have a ton of dragons, like maybe 5 dragons or something like that, then maybe you can include this. It's just not a card that I would generally prioritize or really want to include in most decks. Moving on to red, we're starting off with the best again. We've got Channeled Dragonfire, 1 mana deal 2, and then it's got that Harmonize ability. You can pay 7 mana or discount it, and that's just really nice to have access to. And it's any target, so you can even burn your opponent out with this card. Next is Molten Exhale, 2 mana, deal 4, sometimes at instant speed if you've got a dragon. Just an excellent card. Next is Overwhelming Surge, 3 mana, deal 3, and then sometimes you can even kill a non-creature artifact as a bonus, which is excellent if you can ever snipe an equipment or something like that. Then Unsparing Boltcaster, another card that plays great with mobilized tokens or just being able to attack in general. Dealing 5 to a creature an opponent controls that would dealt damage this turn is really going to help you finish off creatures in combat and make your opponent not want to block. Next is Equilibrium Adept, so just a 4 mana 2/4 that exiles the top card of your library, gives you some time to play it, and then becomes a pretty formidable attacker when you do have that flurry enabled. And so Equilibrium Adept, just a card you're going to want to play. Next is Rescue Leopard. So it's a 3 mana 4/2, but it does give you some card filtering, plays really well with Harmonize, and overall is just a card that you should be pretty happy to include in your decks. Next is Twin Bolt, 2 mana, deal 2. So if your opponent has something like 2/1s or 3/1s or things like that, you're going to be really happy to see this card. But 2 mana to kill a creature with 2 toughness is also totally fine. There's also Narset's Rebuke, so it's a 5 mana, deal 5 something. It exiles the creature, which can certainly be relevant for all of those cards with renew abilities, and you even get a mana rebate to help you double spell, so just a rock solid removal spell. Next is Iridescent Tiger, so it's a 5 mana 3/4, but you get all of the mana back, which even fixes your colors for potential splashes if you are doing that. Not that you'd really want to rely on the Tiger for the splash, but it's nice upside as well, so it also just helps with double spells and things like that. Next is Zurgo's Vanguard. This card hits like a truck. It is basically a 3 mana 2/3 on its own, but if you have any other creatures, this card's going to do a ton of work, and Mobilize 1 is really good with this card as well. It almost attacks as a 3/3 because it's a 3 mana 1/3 on defense. Then when you attack, you make a 1/1. It's attacking as a 2/3, and there's a 1/1. So kind of attacks as a 3/3 on its own, but generally a lot of higher ceiling to be even better than that. Next is Seize Opportunity, so it can be a little bit of card advantage, a little bit of combat trick, really punish your opponents for making some blocks in combat on your mobilized tokens. Just overall going to be a card that you're happy to play. Next is Sunrise Strike Master, so 2 mana, ramp in red, which is pretty cool. Usually you'd see that in green, and you can even kill flying creatures, so taking down those dragons in the late game, or just attack as a 3/1 if the coast is clear. Next is Shock Brigade, so it's a 2 mana 1/3 with Menace, so it's hard to block, and it gets to just attack in and mobilize, so it almost plays out as a 2 mana 2/3 in the early turns of the game, but also synergizes with any cards that care about having those mobilized tokens around, and so overall a really solid creature for combat early in the game. Then there's Shocking Sharpshooter, so it's a 2-mana 1/3 as well with reach, and when another creature enters, it deals 1 damage to target opponent. So this can really add up in a hurry, especially if you have a lot of mobilized cards, and this card is going to be a must-answer threat in a lot of situations. Next is Storm Shriek Feral. So it's a 5-mana 3/3 flying haste that can pump itself. So that's just a reasonable top-end card. But generally, you're going to be able to cast the Omen ability to discard a card and draw 2 cards, which is just going to keep you from mana flooding and things like that. So it's just kind of a solid card on either end. And so it's a solid card overall. Next is Jeskai Devotee. Once again, this card goes from filler to solid if you are playing Jeskai, because color fixing is very valuable in a set that you want to be playing these 3 colors in. And if you're able to get that flurry enabled, it gets +1/+1 until end of turn. So a nice little solid card there. It's just not as good outside of Jeskai, and so it's going to be kind of falling into that filler, not really qualifying as a build around quite. So just putting it in filler. Next is Underfoot Underdog. So 3 mana for a 1/2 and a 1/1. Totally solid if your deck cares about going wide, and also has the ability to make things hard to block, which can definitely be useful for letting you continue to attack with cards with Mobilize and things of that nature. It's just a little bit expensive, and some decks won't care about the going wide aspects of the card as much. Next is Meticulous Artisan. So 4 mana 3/3 prowess is just a little bit expensive. It makes a treasure, so it can help you like double spell down the road, but just generally a little bit small for 4 mana and just doesn't like have card advantage or things like that. Next is Summit Intimidator. So again, totally reasonable card. 4 mana 4/3 reach, makes something unable to block. It's just not as impressive as other things you can be doing for expensive mana values. Next is Fire Rim Form. So a nice little combat trick, +2/+0 and first strike, and the +2/+0 even sticks around. So it's just a totally filler, reasonable combat trick card. It's just you don't always have room for tons of combat tricks in your deck. Next is Devoted Duelist. A 2 mana 2/1 is just kind of poor stat line, especially because it doesn't block mobilized tokens, which is something to consider with every card that has 1 toughness in this set, where just not being able to block those mobilized tokens means that you could take a lot more damage. But this card's trying to attack anyway and can deal some extra damage, so in the right deck, it can definitely be a solid card. There's also Wild Rides. This card's pretty weak, but if you care about double spelling, sometimes it can help with that. And it can be kind of a threatening card if you can manage to discard it into your graveyard or something like that. Because with the Harmonize, you can sometimes just hit your opponent, like play a card, harmonize this out, hit them with a big fly or something like that, or just play Wild Ride and then flash it back in the same turn for 6 mana to get 6 extra damage out of nowhere to get a double spell trigger. So there are some uses for this card. It's just generally not always going to be the most useful. Then we've got a build around card, Fleeting Effigy. This card's really good for enabling your flurry cards because at the beginning of your end step, it goes back to your hand. And so you just get a 1 mana way to get a spell every turn. So in the mid turns, you can just be like, okay, whatever spell I'm normally going to play, and then play Fleeting Effigy. So even if it can't attack, even if it's just being used as a 1 mana way to play a spell, it's really good at enabling flurry. And so it fits great into those decks. It's sometimes okay in an aggressive deck, but generally you'd rather play something that can stay on the battlefield and just permanently deal damage instead of having to invest mana every turn. Next is War Effort. So this card, if you are going for a mobilized strategy, is absolutely fantastic because all of those mobilized tokens go from 1/1s to 2/1s, which just doubles their power level. And so all these cards that are like 1/3 make mobilize 1, all of a sudden are attacking for 4 instead of attacking for 3, as if it was just a normal 2/2 or things like that. So a lot of these cards are deliberately lower power, and so but because they have mobilize, and so if you have War Effort, then they're going to be attacking and almost doubling their effect, which is really, really powerful. So War Effort is perfect in those Mardu decks. Next is Reverberating Summons. I would just call this card bad. It's kind of hard to enable, and the fact that you have to pay so much mana to get some cards out of it, or making a 3/3 is a little bit tricky, and all that stuff, it's just a little bit too finicky for my liking, though there are going to be decks where if you have a bunch of ways to enable Flurry consistently, then you can just use this, but generally I would avoid this card, and just if you get it in a deck and it ends up being okay, then so be it, but that's not a card I would prioritize in draft. Next is Breaching Dragonstorm. 5 mana to get a random card from your deck is just a little bit too unreliable, in my opinion. The fact that you could get like a 1-drop out of this is just really bad, especially because you could hit a combat trick, you could hit a removal spell without having a good target. And sure, you can put it into your hand if those are the case, but like putting a combat trick in your hand makes it worse because your opponent knows you have it. And overall, for 5 mana, you're not getting a ton of value out of this card. Next is green, and coming up first is Piercing Exhale. So 2 mana instant. If you behold a dragon, then you can surveil 2, but even without that, 2 mana, and then you can basically deal damage equal to your biggest creature's power to a target creature or planeswalker at instant speed. Just an excellent card. This card has always performed really well, and it's a card you're going to be happy to take early. Next is Traveling Botanist. This card plays great with Harmonize because it not only triggers when it attacks, but also because that becomes a tap, but also if you're harmonizing with it, so you can trigger it multiple times, gives you card selection, and also lets you draw lands. So that's a nice little card to have access to, especially on a 2 mana 2/3. Next is Inspirited Vanguard, so 5 mana 3/2, but it endures 2, so you can come into play as a 5 mana 5/4, and then whenever it attacks, you can either make a 2/2 creature or put 2 more counters on it, so a really nice 5-drop. Next is Knockout Maneuver, really good removal spell. Put a counter on a creature, then have it deal damage equal to its power to target creature an opponent controls. Just really efficient for 3 mana. Next is Trade Route Envoy. There's plenty of counters in this deck, and so playing a 4 mana 4/3 that draws you a card is just going to be excellent. You're going to be very happy to do this. And if you don't draw a card, then you can make it a 4 mana 5/4. So even in the case where you're not drawing a card, which you would prefer, you're still going to be fairly happy playing this card, which I generally imagine you're going to be drawing cards most of the time. Next is Formation Breaker. So it's a 2 mana 2/1, but if you have a creature with a counter, it acts as a 3/3. And so if you play this on turn 2 and then put a counter on it on turn 3 with some effect, then all of a sudden you're attacking them with a 4/4 on turn 3, and it's really hard to block. So just really a great card. And even though it doesn't necessarily play the best in decks without as many counters, it's going to be a card that's at least solid in those decks. And in the decks that really build around it, it's going to be fantastic. Next is Anok Wayfarer, and I know that maybe means build around grade, but the card is just, there's a lot of counters running around, so it's not really, you don't have to do all that much work. Next is Anok Wayfarer, so 2 mana 1/1, and you can mill 3, and you put a land, so it draws you cards, a card potentially in the early turns. Also triggers cards that care about cards leaving your graveyard because you mill the land and then put a land from among those into your hand, so it triggers some of those effects. And if you don't, you can put a counter on this, so it can trigger your +1/+1 counter synergies early as well. Speaking of cards that care about having cards leave your graveyard, this is the perfect one to go with that other one. So it's a 3-drop. When one or more cards leave your graveyard, put a +1/+1 counter on it. So if you got that land, for example, you would put a counter on this guy. If you renew a card, you would put a counter on this guy. If you harmonize, you put a counter on this guy. Lots of ways to get counters on this guy, and all attached to a 3/3 trampler on its base for 3 is just good. Next is Sage of the Fang, so moving down a little bit to the solid cards, but in a counters deck, this card can definitely be boosted. A 3-mana 2/2 that puts a counter on a creature, and then the renew ability is really good if you already have some counters on a creature, because you put a counter and then double those counters for 4 mana as a renew ability, so really solid. Next is Snakeskin Veil. This card is so annoying. It's really hard to deal with. You can use it to protect your creatures from removal, which is generally when you're going to want to use it. In the early turns, you can use it to win symmetrical combat. So like your 2/2 will all of a sudden get a counter and kill their 2/2 if they make a block like that. And oftentimes, if you have a really powerful bomb rare, you can like use your Snakeskin Veil, just hold that up for the entire game so your opponent can never really kill it. So Snakeskin Veil is just a really solid card and fuels +1/+1 counter synergies. Next is Rain Veil Rejuvenator. This card's really good if you have any graveyard synergies going on. Without those, it's still solid as a 4 mana 2/4 that taps for 2. But if you have graveyard synergies, milling 3 can oftentimes hit you a card that has Renew or has Harmonize, and then Rain Veil Rejuvenator is excellent in your deck. Next is Sagu Pummeler, 4 mana 4/4 reach, just totally solid card. And for 5 mana, you can exile it from the graveyard to put 2 counters and a reach counter on target creatures. So really powerful card, and honestly could all just move up into the best category as well, depending on how much time you'll have to activate the 5 mana renew ability in your deck or based on your strategy. Next is Champion of Dusan, 3 mana 4/2 Trampler is just reasonable, and then the fact that it has the 2 mana ability to put a counter and a trample counter onto a creature once this thing dies is just excellent. This card's really good. It's just totally solid. 3 mana 4/2 is not the greatest stats on its own, but generally speaking, this card's going to perform really, really well and could honestly move up in the categories as well, depending on how you need. And also, because it has high power, it plays well with harmonized cards. So this card's great. Next is Dragon Sniper. So 1/1 with a bunch of keywords for 1 mana. It holds counters really, really well. It plays well with fight spells or punch spells or things like that. The punch spells, like the ones that we already talked about, that have it deal damage because of the death touch, and overall just a really solid card. Next is Rite of Renewal, 4 mana to get some card advantage by returning things from your graveyard to your hand, and also can mess with your opponent's graveyard, which is really nice, or just shuffle in some cards that you want a chance to draw again is also a nice upside to have. And so Rite of Renewal, a really reasonable card. Next is Sagu Wildling. So it's a 1 mana way to fix your mana, which is really important to be able to cast 3-color spells or things like that are more powerful, but also a 5 mana 3/3 gain 3 flyer is a nice little backup plan to have in the later turns. Next is Sultai Devotee. I said that the black one was the best one. This one fights it for the best Devotee in the cycle because Death Touch is such a good ability. They're both pretty close in my opinion because of that. 2 mana 2/1 that can filter your mana is just really nice to have. Next is Undergrowth Leopard. So 2 mana 2/2 Vigilance is reasonable stats, and then you can sack it to destroy artifacts or enchantments, which will come up. Then there's Doziet Earthcarver, which is a big creature. You're generally going to want to make a 4/4 into 3/3 because that's going to protect you from removal the best. But overall, the Earthcarver is going to be a solid card. And also, if you want the counters, you can get the counters and maybe fuel some synergies. Moving on to some filler, we've got Sarkhan's Resolve, so it can kill flyers or be a combat trick, which almost pushes it up into the solid tier. But especially if you're lacking interactions, so you can maybe kill those flyers that are pesky. But generally, just 2 mana for +3/+3 is a little bit weaker, which is the default mode, so that's why it's in the filler category. Next is Heritage Reclamation, just a bunch of very niche effects that are going to come up from time to time, so you can include this card in your deck, but generally not something you're going to need to prioritize. Crotic Nest Guard, so 3 mana 4/4, but the defender, so it can't attack, which does limit where it's going to be the most useful. But in the late game, you can use it, so again, kind of a filler card. There's the Roamer's Routine, which it's just 3 mana for ramp is kind of not where you want to be, unless you're trying to go for like a 5-color strategy, and this card's just a little bit weaker. And even though it's got Harmonized, by the time you have 5 mana or a big creature and stuff like that, you're not going to really care as much about getting extra mana fixing or an extra land into play. Next is Synchronized Charge, so it's just a little bit of a weak effect, putting 2 counters and then buffing, like giving them Vigilance and Trample is just a weak effect. This card's almost in the bad tier, but the fact that you can cast it twice can definitely lead to some big turns in the late game, and especially if you mill it over because of the Harmonize ability, it's just generally a little bit of a weaker card. Then we've got a build around card, Encroaching Dragonstorm. The fact that 4 mana to get 2 lands that you want is pretty reasonable. This card could also fall into the filler category because going from 4 to 6 isn't good in every strategy. But if you're trying to build like a 5-color deck or something like that, where you're trying to splash a bunch of colors, Dragonstorm is great because you can play Dragonstorm, get the mana you need to cast a dragon, play that dragon, bounce the Dragonstorm, and then play the Dragonstorm again to get the mana you need to cast another dragon if you're trying to play a 5-color deck, which is why I wanted to put it into the build around category, because I think calling it filler would be disingenuous to the true power level of this sort of effect, especially if you're trying to play 5-color. There is, however, the Dragon Brood's Relic, which I do think is just kind of bad. If you are trying to play 5-color, it doesn't enable that particularly well. If you are, though, you can use it as a payoff. It's just that's not going to be a strategy that comes up as often. And so generally a 2-mana thing that needs you to have another creature in play to be able to fix your mana and also taps that creature, not a card I'd recommend playing, because especially because getting to the Wooburg for the second activated ability is not a particularly realistic thing to do in a lot of decks. Though if you do have a lot of mana fixing, you can slot this card in if you want to get that 8-mana activated ability. It's just so much mana. Next, we're going on to the multicolored cards. So first we have Armament Dragon. And I will say, with all these cards that are 3 colors, you have to be able to cast them. So you're going to generally be like 2 colors and splashing the third. So if you're playing like a black-green deck splashing white and you have a good number of mana sources, that's kind of how I'm imagining you're going to be able to cast these cards. And if you aren't able to cast them, then just downgrade them accordingly. And if you're drafting and you don't have the mana fixing, you can't afford to take these cards. But if you're in sealed and you have plenty of fixing, or you're in your draft and you already got some fixing, or you think it's early enough that you're going to be able to pick up some fixing, that's kind of how I'm evaluating all of these cards for these criteria. But this card's just great. So it's just going to be able to distribute those counters. So you get a 3/4, but also buff up to 3 other creatures. And the flexibility, the power level is just a great card. Next is Sonic Shrieker. This card is fantastic. So it's a 5-mana 4/4 dragon, can kill a creature and gain you some life, or deal damage directly to a player and make them discard a card. So either way, you're getting a 2-for-1, and it's just excellent. Just all around really good card. Next is Kick Guardian. It's 6 mana for a 6/5, flying Vigilance Trample, so it's huge, really hard to deal with, and your opponent can't even kill it before it deals damage. So at the very least, it's going to be able to trade with something in combat, or usually eat something in combat, or hit them for 6. And so that's often going to be good enough to finish the game off. Next is Keru Goldkeeper, so 4 mana 3/3 flyer, a little bit smaller, but if it goes into your graveyard, the renew ability is fantastic. Putting 2 counters and a flying counter on a creature basically turns it into a must deal with threat, like even a 2/2, like turning a 2/2 into a 4/4 flyer. Thank you. Next, or a 4/4 into a 6/6 flyer is like almost better than playing the 3/3 on its front face. And you can get a bunch of treasure tokens when you are using renew abilities and things like that, or harmonize. And overall, Keru Goldkeeper is great. Next is Jeskai Shrinekeeper. So you play this on turn 5, hit your opponent, gain a life, draw a card, and then your opponent has to answer it. A lot of the time, you're going to be able to get that first card before your opponent can answer this, or even have the opportunity to answer this, which makes it an excellent top-end threat. Then there's Mammoth Bellow, which is just messed up. You play a 5-mana 5/5, and then you can harmonize out another 5/5. And just 2 5/5s for 1 card is really, really good. And the harmonize here is actually relevant, because if you have like a 4/2 or something, you can harmonize out this for 4 mana. If you mill this from some reason, overall, this card is just insane. Just really, really, really strong. Next is Bone Karen Butcher. So it turns all of the attacking tokens you control into Death Touchers, which makes it really hard to answer. It attacks as basically a 4-mana 6/6 as a result. You are going to maybe want to have combat tricks to enable this attacking and let it continue attacking, so because your opponent's going to pretty much have to block it. And so keep that in mind when you are playing the Butcher. Next is Jeskai Brushmaster. With these 4-mana cards that are 3 colors, they are going to be harder to cast on curve, so try to enable them, kind of like with the Cairn guy as well. But a 4 mana 2/4 double strike prowess is just a really good card. If you even cast a single non-creature spell, it hits for 6, and being able to multi-spell with this, or even just using a combat trick on it, you can like kill your opponent with just this card, like the +3/+0, draw a card, like all of a sudden this is hitting your opponent for 12 damage. It's just terrifying. So really strong card. There's also Hardened Tactician, so in white-black, so it can fit into Mardu or Abzan decks, and you can sacrifice those mobilized tokens to draw a card, or those tokens you're making from your Endure abilities. So just a really nice card at 3 mana. There's Glacial Dragon Hunt, so this card fits into Temur or Jeskai. You draw a card, then you can discard a card. So the discarding of the card is a May ability, so you can just use this as a draw card to draw, like, churn through your deck a little bit. But if you discard a non-land card, you can deal 3 to a creature. So it's either card advantage or removal, which is nice to have, especially because the Harmonize ability gives it that card advantage mode where you can just cast it twice, draw 2 cards for 1, and get you a little bit of advantage. Next is his Kishla Skimmer. So if you have those renew abilities, you have ways to get rid of things from your graveyard. You're going to be able to get a lot of extra cards from this, and that's fantastic on a 2/2 flyer for 2 mana, which is already just great stats. Next is Frontline Rush. So 2 mana to make 2 1/1s, totally solid. Or you can buff up one of your creatures, which if you're trying to go wide, you can potentially just kill them with this, or just use it to take down a card that is blocking one of your small creatures. So great flexibility and great rate. There is Kori Mountain Stalwart. So it's a 3 mana 3/3, already good stats. And when you get that flurry ability going, you deal 2 to the opponent and gain 2. So that's really nice upside. Dealing 2 damage is no joke, especially in that life gain always helps. Next is Stalwart Successor. 3 mana 3/2 menace, totally reasonable stat line. And if you put a counter on a creature, if it's the first time, you get an extra counter. So that's good as well, especially for those cards that are going to put like one counter onto several different creatures. That's pretty nice as well. Next is Twin Maw Stormbrood. So the fact that you can play Charring Bite as a 2 mana deal 5 to a creature without flying is just good, because a 2 mana deal 5 card is just a strong effect. And then the fact that if you're playing a deck that can also use white in the late game, you can just play a 6 mana 5/4 flyer that gains you 5 life. Having both those options and both options being good is just excellent. Next is Disruptive Stormbrood. You don't even really need the green part of this card for it to be solid, kind of similar to the last card we looked at. 2 mana, destroy a creature with power 3 or less is just going to be a good card as the Omen. The 5 mana 3/3 flyer that kills an artifact or enchantment. Nice upside to have. You don't always need to even use that though, because you can just cast Petty Revenge and it'll shuffle back into your deck, play Petty Revenge again. It's just nice as a powerful card to have access to as the removal effect. And if you can cast both and have that optionality, it's just really nice. Next is Defibrillating Current. So it's one of these flexible hybrid cards. So you don't even need to be just Mardu to play this. You can just play this in a Jeskai deck and then have a card that's a 4 mana, deal 4 to a creature planeswalker, you gain 2 life. That's just a totally solid card as well. You can play this in Abzan deck, which is in the white-black mode. And so this card's really flexible and also just a really strong card. Especially if you're Mardu, it's even better. But even outside of just Mardu, it's going to be useful in a lot of different archetypes. Next is Dragonclaw Strike. So again, keep in mind with these hybrid cards, you don't have to just play them in the like default color combo, though they are at their best there, because being able to cast them for 3 is great. But doubling the power and toughness of a creature you control, just like imagine doubling the power and toughness of like your 4/2 trample guy, and all of a sudden it's an 8/4, and you have it fight a creature and then you hit them for 8 trample. Or you just have a bigger creature, like you have a 4/4 or a 5/5, just like you can hit them for so much damage with this, just with the doubling mode and killing their blocker. And so that's really, really good to have as a 3 mana potential play. There is Rakshasa's Bargain as a great card advantage spell. With that hybrid mana, you don't have to play this in just a Sultai deck, as we already discussed. And oftentimes you want to cast your card advantage spells last anyway, so playing this in really any of the decks that can cast it is going to be pretty reasonable. There is Kintree Severance, just a nice removal spell. Again, that flexibility is great to have access to. Skirmish Rhino. This card is inflexible, but if you are playing a deck that an Abzan deck, then this card's pretty nice. 3 mana, 3/4. Call out to Siege Rhino, of course, and draining them for 2 is pretty reasonable on the 3 mana 3/4. It is hard to cast on curve, but if you can do that, it's going to be really scary for your opponents, and even casting it in the mid to late game is also good. Next is Lie in Wait. Again, casting this on curve is hard, but you don't even really want to cast this on curve a lot of the time, because you want to wait to have a big creature card in your graveyard, so you can use this as a formidable removal spell that also gets you a card back, so card advantage, nice 2 for 1. There is Effortless Master. So this card is a little bit hard to use because you want to make sure you cast it as the second spell of a turn. So you play a spell, then you play Effortless Master. It'll enter and realize that you've cast 2 or more spells this turn, and all of a sudden it'll be a 6/5 Vigilance Menace, which is just really, really scary. Playing it even as a 4/3 Vigilance Menace on turn 4 isn't the worst, but if you can just like have a 1 mana play and then like do this on turn 5 and have a 6/5, that's pretty devastating. Next is Auroral Procession. So returning a card from your graveyard to your hand just gets you nice card selection, especially if you have some self-mill. Again, remember, you have to be able to cast these cards. So in the draft portion, you can't take them quite as highly as a monocolored card that's good, but these cards are really powerful, as you are seeing. Next is Host of the Hereafter. So it comes with 2 counters, so it's a 4-mana 4/4. When it dies, you put the counters on something else. And if you have other counters running around, you can just, like, and those creatures are dying, the counters stick around, which is really powerful to have access to. There is Marshal of the Lost. So 4-mana 3/3 Death Touch that buffs your attackers is just a totally solid stat block. But yeah, Purging Stormbrood, again, this card, the Omen ability is totally reasonable on its own. +2/+2 lifelink and hexproof is a reasonable combat trick. But also a 5-mana 4/4 that removes counters from a creature can also be a nice little upside as well. So both options pretty reasonable, and so it's a solid card. You don't even have to be able to play both modes. You can just play one or the other, but being able to play both is what really makes this solid. Next is Runescale Stormbrood. So the Chilling Screech mode is not that great because there's not a ton of mana value 2 or less spells that you really care about countering, but the 4-mana 2/4 flyer is pretty reasonable. It's a relatively cheap dragon for any of your Behold cards, and also it just really, it's like almost got double prowess for your, but doesn't buff the toughness, but you don't really need the toughness boost. So if you cast a couple of non-creature spells, then you can really just hit them your opponent for like 6 damage or something like that once you've played the Runescale Stormbrood, which is nice to have an option in your aggressive decks, so a nice little threat. Then there is Whirling Stormbrood. So 5-mana 4/3 flash flying that lets you cast sorceries and dragons with flash. It's just a really good, like, solid card on its own. And then the option of using the Dynamic Soar as a way to put 3 counters on something is also nice, because 3 mana put 3 counters on something is no joke, especially if there's some counter synergies. So keep that in mind. Your Whirling Stormbrood can definitely do some work, and being able to have optionality of both is also a powerful thing to keep in mind. There is Reputable Merchant. Again, the flexibility hybrid mana, so you can kind of cast this in any deck, but you don't really want to cast this one outside of Abzan, because paying 4 mana for this effect wouldn't really be worth it. So you really only want this one in your Abzan decks, and then you can get a 3-mana 3/3 that dies into putting a counter, or a 3-mana 2/2 that puts a counter on something else, things like that, but generally you don't want to overpay for this effect. Then there is Gurmag Nightwatch. Again, this card's not the one that you really want to be overpaying for, but it does mill you a little bit of cards and get you a little bit of card selection as well, which is pretty useful. And then there is Monastery Messenger, which is similarly kind of give you a little bit of selection, though you don't really want to be overpaying for this sort of effect. That's kind of the theme of these last few. But you can put a non-creature, non-land from your graveyard on top, so get back a removal spell, something like that. Card advantage maybe, instants or sorceries. Or any non-land, non-creature. And then Reigning Victor. We already showed this card off a little bit, but this is, again, kind of the sort of card you don't really want to be playing outside of Mardu, because playing it for 3 mana is solid. Playing it for 4 mana is a little bit weaker. So, like, maybe you could really fit it into, like, a deck that couldn't really get, like, a white-black deck that was a little bit more aggressive or something like that. But generally, you're going to want to focus on playing this in Mardu, but it can actually do some work there. Mobilize is nice, and also enabling some attacks with the Indestructible mode. Then there's Riverwheel Sweep. So this card definitely can kind of fit into some other strategies, but tapping a creature and putting stun counters on it is just a it's not a permanent solution to any threat. And then you are getting a card back out of this, but it's not getting you card advantage because you can only play one of those 2 cards that you're exiling. So again, reasonable card, but it's a sorcery, and it's not going to be that great outside of Jeskai, because Jeskai you can use this to enable double spells and things like that. But if once you're paying more than 3 mana for this, it's a little bit inefficient. There's Temur Tawny back. So 3 mana 4/3 that draws a card and discards a card is great. 4 mana 4/3 that draws a card and discards a card, less great. So generally, again, one of those cards that's only going to be really good in Temur, but it can be played elsewhere if you really need it. It's a big creature, not really that complicated. Moving on to the lands section and the artifacts section. I've kind of grouped the multicolored and then lands and artifacts last. These cards are really good. These enter the battlefield tapped that can tap for any of your colors are going to be so good for enabling your strategies. So Sandstep Citadel, Mystic Monastery, Opulent Palace, Nomad Outpost, and Frontier Bivouac are just going to be excellent cards, especially the ones that aren't in green, because they don't have access to any of green's fixing. So one of the Mardu ones or the Jeskai ones is really going to be especially relevant for those strategies, just giving you all your colors right off the bat. These cards are really high picks, and if you are trying to play 5 color or something like that, they're also really high picks for that strategy. So don't sleep on these cards just because they're simple. They are very powerful for these 3 color decks. Next is Evolving Wild. So this is definitely a solid card. It gives you similar benefit of being able to get any of your colors, but it can't tap for multiple of them at a time. So you can use this to fix your mana a little bit, especially, as we said, relevant for decks that don't have fixing built into their color. Then there is these monuments. So the Abzan Monument is definitely a nice one. You want to be playing these in their deck specifically. Sometimes there'll be an effect like this where you play the Abzan one in your deck that just cared about getting swamps or forests, but you really want to be able to activate the secondary effect of these artifacts. So I'd recommend only playing these in your decks that have the ability to pay the secondary ability of, maybe for this one, 4 mana, make a big spirit token where the X is the greatest toughness among creatures. And then there's similarly solid effects. So Jeskai, you can make a couple of birds, similarly going to be solid in a Jeskai deck. Also triggers your non-creature spell effects in Jeskai, so your prowess cards. There's Sultai Monument, which is going to make some zombie tokens. There is Mardu Monument, which makes some warrior tokens that then have haste and menace, so that can definitely actually deal some real damage. And then there is Teamer, which is going to make a big elephant for 6 mana, so not even that inefficient for getting a big creature. So these monuments are all really solid for their decks as well. And then there is Embermouth Sentinel, which is almost good enough to be up to the solid level in this set, where mana fixing is so important and being able to cast your powerful 3-color spells is so important. If you have some of those 3-color spells, you're really going to want to have cards like Embermouth Sentinel to make sure you can play them on curve and stuff like that. So in those decks where you don't have a lot of fixing, the Embermouth Sentinel can definitely get bumped up, but on its face, it's a little bit weak. It's just a 2-mana 2/1. If you have a dragon, you get the land just put into play, but that's not going to be generally when you need the fixing the most. So just keep that in mind. But this card can definitely be moved up to solid if you really need the fixing. Just like prioritize it higher. There's Boulderborn Dragon. This is one of those cards from that blue guy we looked at. Like, he can fetch up the Boulderborn Dragon. It's just not a great card. 5 mana 3/3 is just a bit small, even though it has vigilance and gets you some surveilling. Then there's Dragonstorm Globe. This is the other guy the blue guy can go get. Each dragon enters with an additional counter. You're not going to have generally enough dragons for that to really matter that much. And then you can add mana of any color. So kind of bottom of the barrel fixing, but definitely fixing that you can use if you really need it. Then there's Watcher of the Wayside. 3 mana 3/2, mills a couple cards, so works well if you have some renew stuff and gains you a little bit of life, but generally not a huge priority as well. And then finally we have Jadecast Sentinel, 4 mana 1/5 reach. Can mess with your opponent's graveyard a little bit, but 4 mana 1/5 is just pretty like weak stats in this modern age of Magic the Gathering. And so I'd advise against playing this card if you have the option, because there's going to be better stuff you can put in your deck. Not that this card does nothing, but it's just going to be pretty weak, and a 4 mana 1/5 is not really where you want to be these days. Anyway, that's going to do it for this video. Thank you for watching. If you made it to the end, leave hashtag TarkirPrep in the comment section down below. Remember to hit the thumbs up button, subscribe for more videos, and comment with your questions, thoughts, and feedback. I'm really looking forward to the set. I hope you are too, and I'll see you on Tarkir.